Snow had a way of making cruelty look orderly. By late afternoon, Voss Manor stood beneath a pale winter sky like a painting too expensive to contain sorrow. Frost gathered in the carved stone lions at the front steps. Smoke rose in calm gray ribbons from the chimneys. The windows glowed amber. From the road, nothing looked broken. Then the front doors opened. 2 footmen emerged first, uncomfortable in the particular way decent men become uncomfortable when ordered to perform indecent work. Between them walked Lady Seraphina Aldwell. She was not dressed for exile. Her dark curls had loosened from their pins and rested damp against her cheeks. Snow caught in them and stayed. Her winter coat had not been fastened properly. One gloved hand remained folded protectively over the gentle curve beneath her ribs. She did not struggle. That seemed to unsettle everyone more. Servants had gathered beneath the portico in careful rows, pretending duty while collecting spectacle. A stable boy stared openly. A maid began crying before she understood why. Seraphina kept her eyes ahead. Not proud. Not defeated. Only quiet. At the top of the steps stood Lady Karina Voss in white fur and pearl buttons, untouched by weather, as if winter itself had signed an agreement not to disturb her. Her expression carried the satisfaction of someone finally correcting a mistake. "You leave this house," she announced, not speaking to Seraphina so much as speaking through her to every listening ear, "under accusation of theft, deception, and conduct entirely unfit for this family." No one moved. Karina continued. "The late Duchess's brooch was discovered among your possessions. Further documents suggest intentions toward securing influence within this household." A folded paper appeared in her gloved hand. She lifted it slightly. "The Duke has reviewed everything personally." There was a murmur. Seraphina closed her eyes once. Not because she had expected rescue. Only because hearing it aloud made it real. The brooch. The letter. The lies had become objects now. Heavy enough to carry. A week earlier she had opened her trunk and found Helena Voss's missing sapphire brooch beneath folded dresses she had not touched in days. She had stared at it for nearly a minute before understanding. Then she had understood all at once. Later she had learned about the letter. A letter claiming she intended to charm Duke Alaric Voss, exploit his grief, and secure inheritance through calculated affection. She had never seen the letter. Never needed to. By then the house had already changed temperature around her. Doors opened slower. Voices lowered. People stopped meeting her eyes. Someone had built a story. And stories, once believed, became architecture. Karina descended one step. "Do you deny any of it?" Seraphina looked up. Snow drifted between them. Her green eyes remained astonishingly steady. "No." Karina blinked. A few servants shifted. Karina had expected pleading. "Then you admit." "I deny giving dignity to falsehood by arguing with it." Silence spread. Karina smiled. "A sharp thing. How noble." Seraphina looked at her for a long moment. Not with hatred. That seemed to irritate Karina more. Then Seraphina said softly, "You must be very lonely." The words landed strangely. Karina's expression hardened instantly. "Remove her." The footmen stepped forward again. Seraphina moved before they could guide her. As she descended the steps, she passed windows bright with evening light. In one of those windows she saw movement. 3 faces. Edmund. Rose. Felix. She stopped. The footmen hesitated. Edmund stood straight despite being 10 and carrying too much seriousness for his age. Rose pressed both hands to the glass. Felix looked confused in the terrible way children look before they learn betrayal exists. Seraphina remembered the first day she met them. Edmund had apologized after dropping a spoon. Rose had hidden sketches because someone once laughed. Felix had cried after falling and then apologized for crying. She had not arrived to save anyone. Only to teach. Only to help. But grief had left the manor with windows open, and children absorbed weather. 18 months. That was all. 18 months of reading aloud. Correcting lessons. Walking gardens. Teaching Edmund that caution and kindness were not enemies. Teaching Rose that art did not require permission. Teaching Felix that emotions were not evidence of weakness. Small things. Invisible things. The kind that become foundations later. She remembered Rose bringing her a crooked drawing and whispering, "Do you really think it's beautiful?" She remembered Edmund standing between Felix and a scolding servant because someone had finally shown him protection could be gentle. She remembered Felix climbing into her lap and asking whether brave people cried. She had answered yes. Often. The memory nearly undid her. She lowered her gaze. Her hand remained over her stomach. No one in this house knew. Not really. They knew enough to punish. Not enough to understand. Months earlier she had received a letter with black borders and seawater stains. A young naval officer. Kind. Earnest. Gone before reaching shore. Gone before hearing the words she had rehearsed 100 times. She had hidden the pregnancy afterward. Not from shame. From fear. A governess carrying a child belonged nowhere respectable. Karina had noticed first. Karina noticed weaknesses the way hunters notice tracks. After that, everything moved quickly. The brooch appeared. The letter appeared. Judgment appeared. She reached the iron gates. Beyond them stretched snow and the city. Behind her remained warmth. Somewhere inside those walls sat Duke Alaric Voss. He had not come. That hurt more than she expected. Not because she loved him. She did not. But because she had believed him better than silence. Earlier that night, he had sat alone in his study. The forged letter open. The fire low. He had read every line. Read accusations. Read intention where none existed. Read betrayal into kindness. He had signed the dismissal order. His grief had become efficient. His late wife's absence had hollowed places inside him and then convinced him they should stay empty. He had not called for Seraphina. Had not asked. Had not looked. He signed. Folded the paper. Turned his chair away from the window. Now she stood outside because of that decision. The gate opened. Cold air reached her fully. Behind the glass above the entrance, Rose suddenly lifted one hand. Pressed it flat. Felix began crying. Edmund placed his arm around both siblings and stared directly at Seraphina with devastated composure. She smiled. Small. Impossible. Then she mouthed the words carefully. I will be all right. The children understood immediately. That was the cruelest part. She turned and stepped into the snow. Behind her, the iron gates closed with the soft, final sound of a book being shut. And in the upstairs window, 3 children stood watching the woman they loved disappear into white silence, while none of them yet understood they had just lost the closest thing they had left to a mother. The first morning without Seraphina felt accidental. Breakfast appeared at the usual hour. Silver lids lifted. Tea steamed. Curtains were opened to admit pale winter light. Nothing in Voss Manor forgot its duties. Only the people did. Edmund sat upright at the long table and cut his food into precise squares he never ate. Rose folded her napkin into smaller and smaller pieces until it looked like something left behind by a frightened bird. Felix asked once whether Seraphina would come back after lunch. No one answered quickly enough. Lady Karina answered eventually. No. One word. Cling. Final. Felix nodded and stared at his untouched porridge. Across the table, Duke Alaric Voss remained unreadable. He drank his tea. Signed papers. Said little. His grief had taught him how to survive by becoming smaller inside. The children had inherited the method. Days passed. 12 of them. Snow continued. The manor settled into strange habits. Rose stopped carrying pencils. She stacked every sketchbook she owned into a neat pile beneath her bed and covered them with folded cloth as though burying them. Felix stopped sleeping in his own room. Every evening he appeared quietly at Edmund's door carrying his blanket. Edmund never commented. He simply moved over. At meals, Karina began sitting in places she had never occupied before. First near the head of the table. Then at the head. No one objected. That frightened Edmund more than if someone had. On the 9th day he caught Rose staring at the empty chair where Seraphina used to sit during lessons. Rose whispered, "Do empty places disappear if nobody talks about them?" Edmund had no answer. On the 12th night the snow deepened. The manor became muffled. The children gathered in Edmund's room after midnight. Only candlelight. Only whispers. Felix sat wrapped in blankets. Rose stood by the window. Nobody said Seraphina's name at first, as though saying it might make losing her permanent. Finally Rose spoke. Her voice was small. "I saw something." Edmund looked up. She swallowed. "The night before they found the brooch. The room changed." Rose stared at her hands. "I couldn't sleep." Neither brother interrupted. "I went downstairs." She hesitated. "I saw Aunt Karina coming out of Seraphina's room." Silence. Rose continued quietly. "She was carrying something." Edmund stared. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Rose looked genuinely surprised. "They already decided." That hurt. Not because she was wrong. Because she was 10% too young to know that. Felix shifted under the blankets. Then he said something that seemed too simple to matter. "Father doesn't know what she's really like." Edmund looked at him. Felix shrugged. "He didn't spend enough time with her." The sentence stayed in the room. Not angry. Not accusing. Just true. Edmund thought about lessons. tea trays, garden walks. How Seraphina always noticed things. How Father rarely looked long enough to notice anyone. How decisions arrived faster than understanding. He stood. Rose blinked. What are you doing? Edmund crossed to the corner and pulled a small tin from beneath books. His savings. Birthdays. Small rewards. Carefully collected. He opened it. Coins. Rose stared. Felix sat up. Edmund said, "Get dressed." They looked at him. He closed the lid. "If she's innocent." He paused, then corrected himself. "If she's cold?" Nobody asked the rest. Before dawn they moved quietly. Rose packed leftover rolls in cloth. Felix found meat pastries. There was one untouched cake Rose had refused earlier that week. She wrapped that too. Edmund counted coins, then put most of them back. Food first. They dressed warmly. Royal blue, white fur, deep red velvet. Children still dressed like children. Even during rebellion. Mrs. Drummond met them unexpectedly in the kitchen. She looked at the bundle, looked at Edmund, then looked away. She walked to the pantry, added another loaf, placed it in his hands. No questions, only, "Mind the ice." The kitchen passage waited behind old shelving. Hidden, narrow, cold. Years ago Mrs. Drummond had shown it to them as a story. Their mother had once used it to meet their father before marriage. Secret meetings. Secret happiness. Now the children escaped through the same corridor. Outside London waited. 5 in the morning. Gas lamps burned orange in mist. Snow softened the city without making it gentle. The children walked. At first with confidence. Then less. They had no address. Only fragments. Westminster Bridge. Someone had heard a servant mention it. Edmund led. Rose carried food. Felix carried belief. The city woke slowly around them. Carts. Smoke. Footsteps. Cold. The bridge emerged gradually. Stone. Mist. The Thames moving beneath like dark breathing. They crossed halfway. Then stopped. Near the northern rail sat a woman. Her coat looked thinner than memory. Dark curls loose. One hand beneath her belly. Her face turned slightly downward. She was speaking. Not loudly. Just enough. Rose held her breath. They moved closer. Seraphina didn't notice. She was saying softly, "I know." Pause. "I know it's cold." Another pause. "I'm trying." Her hand moved gently, as though comforting someone already listening. Edmund felt something split quietly inside him. She looked smaller. Not broken. Just alone. Felix stepped forward before either sibling could stop him. His boots crunched snow. Seraphina looked up. For 1 second she didn't understand what she was seeing. Then she stood too quickly. Stopped. Pressed one hand to the stone rail. Her eyes widened. "Children." Rose started crying immediately. Edmund couldn't speak. Felix approached. Kneeled in snow. Held out the cloth bundle with both hands. His voice came out serious. Almost formal. "We brought you supper." He looked at the bundle. Then added softly, "We're sorry it's cold." Seraphina stared. At the food. At him. At all three. Something moved across her face too quickly to name. She knelt slowly. Took the bundle. Opened it. Bread. Pastries. She closed it again. Her hands trembled. Rose crossed the remaining distance and sat beside her immediately. No hesitation. Just leaned against her. Seraphina made a startled sound and wrapped an arm around her. Felix sat on the other side. Edmund remained standing. She looked up. "What are you doing here?" Rose answered first. "We missed you." Felix nodded. Edmund swallowed. Then said quietly, "Rose saw Karina in your room." Seraphina became still. Snow drifted between them. Edmund continued, "We don't think you did it." The bridge disappeared. The city disappeared. Something in her expression opened. Not relief. Something deeper. Recognition. To be known. To be seen correctly. She looked away. Covered her mouth briefly. Then lowered her hand. And cried. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just tears arriving because there was finally somewhere safe for them to go. Rose pressed closer. Felix took her glove. Edmund sat beside her. For a long time nobody moved. Eventually she asked quietly, "Why did you come?" Edmund looked toward the river. Then back. His face seemed older than 12 days ago. "You made us brave." He looked directly at her. "So we're being brave." Seraphina closed her eyes. Snow gathered quietly around 4 figures on Westminster Bridge. A woman with nowhere to go. 3 children who should have stayed home. And for the first time since the gates closed behind her, Lady Seraphina Aldwell realized something dangerous and impossible. She had been erased by adults, but not by the children who had loved her. The city did not keep secrets well, especially in winter, when smoke hung low and servants moved between houses like veins carrying blood. By morning, Westminster already spoke of the Voss children crossing the bridge, and by afternoon the story had changed shape twice, sharpened by mouths that had never seen it. At the baker's counter, a woman repeated it as truth before she had even finished paying for bread. At the river docks, a porter swore he had seen royal coats in the fog. At the laundress line, someone whispered the word betrayal, though no one agreed who had been betrayed. Duke Alaric Voss descended for breakfast expecting silence, but found absence instead. 3 chairs remained empty, still aligned with impossible precision, as though their owners had only stepped away momentarily. The servants avoided his gaze with practiced discipline, and even the air felt arranged around loss. It was the butler who finally spoke, voice carefully neutral, as if neutrality could soften consequence. The children had left before dawn, he reported, carrying provisions and leaving no instruction behind. He paused only once, then added that the city was speaking of Westminster Bridge. Alaric did not move, but something behind his eyes tightened, like a door being locked from the inside. Later, alone in the chamber once belonging to Helena Voss, Alaric opened the sealed jewel case he had not touched since her death. Dust softened the edges of memory. Inside lay her diary, its pages precise, almost ceremonial in their order. Each entry listed objects of the household, including the sapphire brooch marked as gifted to Karina months before Helena's passing. The truth did not arrive loudly. It simply replaced the lie where it had been sitting. Karina met him in the east corridor as if she had been waiting inside the architecture itself. She wore pearl earrings and certainty, the kind of certainty that depends on other people remaining silent. Alaric did not raise his voice. He simply placed the diary in her line of sight and named each contradiction as it appeared. With every sentence, the corridor seemed to narrow, as though the manor itself was learning to reject her presence. By midday the decision was no longer spoken of but enforced. Karina attempted one final argument, but it dissolved under the weight of documentation and silence. Alaric spoke only once. She was to leave the house by evening. No dramatics followed, only the quiet efficiency of servants obeying an order that felt overdue. In the kitchens, Mrs. Drummond gathered blankets and broth with hands that shook not from fear but from long-delayed satisfaction. She muttered that she had known the truth in her bones long before anyone else bothered to look. At court, Lord Pembridge's name began to fracture quietly, not through public scandal but through carefully delivered messages that reached the right desks at the right time. His involvement in framing the accusation against Seraphina was no longer uncertain. It was documented. He understood, with growing stillness, that influence could not protect him from truth once it had been written down. Karina was found in her rooms preparing as though departure were merely a delayed appointment rather than a consequence. She moved through drawers with controlled precision, yet every motion carried a thin edge of disbelief. When the order was delivered, she did not shout. She did not plead. Instead, she looked at the house as though it had betrayed her by finally remembering what she had done. Outside, the snow had softened into silence. Inside, every corridor felt newly honest, stripped of its previous deception. Mrs. Drummond left the manor before the last of Karina's presence had fully cleared the air. She carried blankets folded under one arm and a stubborn sense that mercy did not wait for permission. London streets were still pale with morning frost, and the river moved like something remembering old pain. She did not stop at markets or corners where gossip gathered, though she could feel it trailing her like breath. At Westminster Bridge, she saw what the city had not yet fully understood. The 3 children stood together in the snow, gathered around Seraphina as though the world had narrowed to that single fragile point. Edmund stood slightly apart, watching the river instead of the city, as if guarding something invisible but important. Rose leaned against Seraphina's shoulder, her eyes closed, as if afraid that opening them might undo the moment. Felix held onto Seraphina's sleeve with quiet determination, as though letting go had become an idea he refused to understand. Mrs. Drummond slowed, realizing something in the arrangement of their bodies that did not belong to chance. Seraphina looked up first, and for a brief moment her expression held both recognition and exhaustion in equal measure. Behind her, the carriage bearing the Voss crest had just come to a stop. The door opened before the wheels had fully settled into stillness, as though urgency had outrun protocol. Alaric stepped out without his coat, a detail so uncharacteristic that even Mrs. Drummond noticed it first. He did not look at the manor nor at the river, but directly toward the cluster of figures near the railing. For a moment, everything in him seemed to hesitate, as though memory and duty were arguing beneath his skin. Edmund was the first to notice him, turning slowly as if he had been expecting this exact moment without knowing it. He did not move closer to his father, but instead shifted slightly to stand between Seraphina and the approaching figure. Rose opened her eyes fully now, as though the sound of footsteps had broken a fragile spell. Seraphina rose slowly, one hand instinctively protecting her stomach, the other steadying herself against the cold stone. Mrs. Drummond stepped forward instinctively, sensing the collision of truths about to occur. The air between them felt suddenly thinner, as though even the city was holding its breath. Alaric's gaze finally met Seraphina's, and in that meeting something unresolved collapsed inward. He took one step forward, then another, but the words he needed refused to form in any language he knew. Felix tightened his grip on Seraphina's sleeve, as if anchoring her to a world that was suddenly unstable. Rose whispered something that only Edmund seemed to hear, and he answered with a single almost imperceptible nod. Seraphina looked between the children and the man she had once been sent away from, as if measuring impossible distances. Snow began to fall more heavily, softening edges of figures, as though the world itself wished to blur decisions. Alaric finally spoke her name, but it came out fractured, like something long and used. Seraphina closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if bracing herself against the sound of it. Edmund stepped fully into the space between them now, his voice quiet but firm beyond his years. "Father," he said, "you should start with sorry." Something almost like pain crossed Alaric's face, not sharp but deep and disorienting. He exhaled slowly, as though releasing years of decisions that had never been properly examined. Then he looked at Seraphina again, no longer as accusation but as consequence. Her silence did not reject him, but it did not rescue him either. Behind them, Mrs. Drummond shifted the blankets in her arms, as if preparing for something inevitable. The river below carried on, indifferent, constant, as if none of this mattered and all of it did. Seraphina opened her eyes again, and for the first time she did not look away from him. Something in that stillness felt like the beginning of an answer neither of them had yet spoken. Alaric took another step forward, slower now, as if each movement required permission from his own conscience. "I was wrong," he said finally, and the words seemed to cost him more than anything he had signed in ink. Rose let out a small breath, as though she had been holding it for 12 days without realizing. Felix looked between the adults, then back at Seraphina, as if checking whether the world was finally safe again. Seraphina's hand tightened slightly around the rail, the only visible sign that she was still holding herself together. The silence that followed was not empty, but full of everything none of them dared to say. And in that suspended moment, the bridge felt less like a place of crossing and more like a place of judgment. Far behind them, the manor's world of certainty had already begun to unravel without making a sound. Seraphina finally spoke, her voice barely more than breath against the falling snow. "I did not come here for apology," she said quietly. For a moment, no one understood what that meant. Then she looked down toward the children, not the man who had once signed her away. Behind her, footsteps approached again, slower this time, and when she turned, she saw not only the Duke but the weight of everything he had finally chosen to understand in the cold widening silence between. The carriage arrived without ceremony, though everything about it carried the weight of ceremony refusing to announce itself. Black wheels cut through snow-softened stone, and the crest on its door seemed darker against the winter light, as if even metal understood the gravity of what it approached. At nearly the same moment, Mrs. Drummond stepped onto the bridge from the opposite side, blankets still folded against her chest, her pace steady in the way of someone who had decided that hesitation belonged only to the uncertain. Seraphina felt the change before she saw it. The air tightened, not with cold but with recognition. Edmund's posture shifted first, his shoulders aligning as though preparing for impact rather than greeting. Rose lifted her head from Seraphina's shoulder, eyes half-lidded from exhaustion but suddenly alert. Felix loosened his grip for the first time in hours, as if sensing that something larger than comfort had entered their fragile circle. When Seraphina turned, she saw the carriage door open. Duke Alaric Voss stepped out without his coat. That detail struck harder than anything else. Not because of vulnerability alone, but because of absence of calculation. He had always been a man who prepared for weather, for rooms, for consequences. Seeing him without that preparation made him feel unfamiliar, as though grief had finally stripped him of habit. He did not speak at first. Neither did she. Snow fell between them in slow agreement with silence. Mrs. Drummond paused a few paces away, choosing not to interrupt what she instinctively understood was not hers to solve but only to witness. Alaric took one step forward, then another. Each movement seemed to cost him something invisible. When he stopped, he was close enough that the distance between them no longer belonged to geography. "I owe you," he began. The sentence broke before it finished. He tried again. "I have done you a—" No structure survived the attempt. Seraphina watched him without moving. Her hand remained near her stomach, not protective now, but steady, as though she had learned that stillness could be its own form of endurance. Behind her, Edmund stepped forward. Not quickly. Not defiantly. Precisely. He stopped at the point where he could be heard without raising his voice. "Father," he said quietly, "you should probably just say sorry first." A pause followed that was almost human in its hesitation. Then, unexpectedly, something eased in Alaric's expression. Not relief. Recognition. "Yes," he said. "You are right." The words landed with more weight than any declaration he had offered since arriving. He turned back to Seraphina. "I am sorry," he said, and this time he did not stop himself from continuing. "Not for what I believed but for not asking. For not seeing. For letting grief decide what truth was allowed to exist in my house." Rose made a small sound, like a breath she had been holding too tightly. Felix looked up at Seraphina as though checking whether permission for hope had been granted. Seraphina did not answer immediately. She studied him, not the title, not the history, but the man standing in the cold as though he had finally arrived too late to avoid honesty. "I know," she said at last. The simplicity of it unsettled him more than anger would have. "You know?" he asked. "I know you were wrong," she replied. "And I know you are only beginning to understand it." A silence followed, not heavy but open, like space waiting to be filled by something uncertain. Alaric exhaled slowly. "I cannot undo what has been done," he said. "No," Seraphina answered. "You cannot." Another pause. The river moved beneath them, indifferent and ancient, as if this moment were only one ripple among many it had already forgotten. "I would like to correct it," he said carefully. "That is not the same thing," she replied. "I understand that." He did not look away. For the first time since the bridge encounter began, Seraphina shifted slightly. Not toward him, but away from certainty. Rose whispered, "Mama," before catching herself, as though the word had slipped out from memory rather than intention. Seraphina closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them they were steadier. Alaric took another step forward. "I am not asking as your duke," he said. "I am not asking as the man who failed to protect you. I am asking as someone who has watched my children choose you when I did not." Edmund did not react to that statement, but something in his posture softened almost imperceptibly. "I am asking," Alaric continued, "for you to come home." The words hung between them. Not command. Not entitlement. Only exposure. Seraphina's gaze flickered toward the carriage behind him, then toward the manor that existed somewhere beyond it, unseen but implied. A place that had once been warmth and then had become exile. "That is not my home," she said. Her voice did not tremble, but something inside it carried distance. "It could be," Alaric replied quietly. He hesitated. Then added, "if you would allow it to become something different." Mrs. Drummond shifted slightly, the blankets in her arms rustling like restrained opinion. She said nothing, but her presence sharpened the reality that this conversation had moved beyond private ruin into shared consequence. Seraphina looked at the children. Rose still leaned against her, refusing to let go even in uncertainty. Felix stood close enough that his sleeve touched hers, as though anchoring her in place by instinct rather than logic. Edmund remained upright, watching her more than his father, as if her answer mattered more than the invitation itself. "You left me once," Seraphina said quietly. Alaric did not deny it. "Yes. And you did not ask me to stay." Another pause. "I did not deserve to," he said. That honesty seemed to cost him more than apology. Seraphina's fingers tightened slightly against the rail. Snow thickened, softening edges of their figures until the world felt partially erased, as if winter itself was uncertain how to record this moment. Edmund spoke again, softer this time. "She didn't leave us," he said. "You made her leave." It was not accusation. It was correction. Alaric closed his eyes briefly, absorbing it without defense. When he opened them, his voice was quieter. "I know." Silence returned. Then Felix stepped forward. He looked up at Seraphina first, not at his father. "Are we going home?" he asked. The question was not rhetorical. It was logistical. Practical. As if home were a place that could be confirmed before it was chosen. Seraphina reached down and adjusted his collar with a motion so familiar it startled her own hands. "I do not know," she said honestly. Felix nodded as though that was acceptable. Rose squeezed her hand. Alaric stepped closer again, stopping this time within reach but not touching. "If you come," he said, "I will not ask you to return to what was taken from you. I cannot rebuild that. But I can build something that does not repeat it." Seraphina looked at him for a long time. Not searching for perfection. Searching for sincerity that could survive time. Behind them, the city continued its indifferent rhythm. A bell rang somewhere distant. A cart passed unseen. Life refused to pause for their fracture. "I am not the same woman who left your gates," she said. "I would not ask you to be," he replied. A breath passed between them. Then Seraphina looked down at Rose, at Felix, at Edmund. At the children who had crossed the city to find what adults had misplaced. Finally she looked at Alaric. "I will not be owned by grief again," she said. "You will not be," he answered. That was the closest thing to agreement the bridge had heard. Seraphina released the rail slowly. Her hand remained in the air for a moment, uncertain not of him, but of what trusting forward might cost. Then she placed it in his. His fingers closed around hers immediately, carefully, as if holding something that might still choose to vanish. Behind them, Mrs. Drummond let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Edmund exhaled once, sharply, like a decision completing itself. Rose smiled without understanding why. Felix simply said, "Good." They began to move toward the carriage together, step by step, while snow continued to fall over Westminster Bridge, covering everything that had been broken without yet deciding whether it would forgive it or simply hide it. And as Seraphina reached the first step upward, she glanced once more at the river beneath them, where reflections blurred and reformed, and wondered whether coming home was the beginning of healing, or only the next place where truth would finally demand its cost. Behind them the city did not notice the moment it had changed them, only that snow kept falling, covering footprints that would not be retraced, while somewhere far above, the manor lights flickered as if remembering what it had lost and regained. Winter returned to Voss Manor like a memory that refused to end. Snow pressed softly against the tall windows of the east wing, where firelight now moved freely through rooms that once felt sealed in grief. The house no longer behaved like a place of judgment. It had begun to behave like a place trying to learn softness again. Seraphina stood at the center of that change without fully trusting it. Her hands rested lightly over the curve of her pregnancy, her breath measured in the careful rhythm of someone who had learned that peace could still be interrupted. Around her, the manor servants moved more gently than before, as though afraid that harshness might once again be remembered by the walls. Alaric watched her from a distance he no longer maintained out of authority but out of caution. There were moments when he still seemed unsure whether he had been forgiven or merely permitted to remain nearby. That uncertainty lived in his posture, in the way he paused before speaking, in the way he no longer signed anything without thinking twice. The children no longer separated themselves from Seraphina's presence. Edmund walked beside her whenever possible, his earlier rigidity softened into something more thoughtful. Rose followed Seraphina through corridors with renewed sketches tucked under her arm, as if creativity had returned with permission. Felix remained closest of all, often pressing his ear gently against Seraphina's side as though listening for the future. The night the child came, the manor felt unusually still. Snow had stopped falling hours earlier, leaving the world outside muted and glassy. Seraphina did not cry out at first. Instead, she closed her eyes and placed one steady hand on the carved bedpost while the other reached instinctively for Alaric's arm. He was there immediately. Not as a duke. Not as a man issuing orders. Only as someone afraid of being too late again. Mrs. Drummond arrived without knocking, carrying the kind of calm that only years of survival can produce. She took charge of the room with quiet efficiency, instructing without raising her voice, preparing without asking permission. The house that once obeyed fear now obeyed purpose. Outside the windows, dawn began to rise in thin lines of pale gold. By the time the first cry broke the silence, the manor had already begun to change in ways it did not yet understand. The sound was small at first, almost fragile, but it carried through the corridors like a declaration that something new had survived where something old had failed. A daughter. Dark hair, furious lungs, a strength that arrived without apology. Seraphina held her close, exhausted but awake in a way she had not been since before exile. Alaric stood beside her, unable to speak for several moments, as if language had become too small for what he was witnessing. Edmund looked down at the child with quiet astonishment, as though recalculating the future in real time. Rose began crying without sadness, overwhelmed by the idea that endings could also become beginnings. Felix simply reached out and touched the baby's hand, then smiled as if confirming that the world still answered gentle questions. They named her Helena Seraphina Voss. The decision did not come from one voice alone. It emerged slowly, shaped by memory and reconciliation, until it felt less like naming and more like restoration. Alaric hesitated at first, the name carrying weight that once belonged to grief. But Seraphina's voice was steady when she said it should be so, and in that steadiness he understood that remembrance did not have to mean pain. In the days that followed, the manor did not return to its old form. Instead, it adjusted. Rooms that had once been avoided became lived in again. The dining table no longer felt like a place of silence but of overlapping conversation. Even Karina's absence, once heavy, began to feel like space reclaimed rather than emptiness endured. News of her departure had already spread beyond London. She did not return. Some said she went south. Others said she disappeared into quieter provinces where names mattered less. What remained certain was that she did not return to Voss Manor again. Lord Pembridge's fall was quieter but more complete. His influence dissolved through corridors of power that had once welcomed him. No trial was necessary. Reputation itself became sentence enough. On a morning that felt warmer than the season should allow, Alaric asked Seraphina to marry him again. There was no ceremony in the request, no performance of authority. He asked as a man who understood that permission mattered more than possession. Seraphina did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked at the children playing near the window, at the baby sleeping in Mrs. Drummond's careful arms, at the house that had once broken her and was now attempting to hold her gently. "You are asking for something you cannot take back," she said finally. "I know," he replied. "And something you cannot guarantee. I know that as well." She studied him for a long moment, searching not for perfection but for consistency. Then she nodded once, slowly. "Yes," she said. Spring arrived not as spectacle but as correction. Snow retreated from gardens, revealing soil that had waited patiently beneath winter's weight. Blossoms returned to the estate trees, scattering pale color across paths once walked in silence. The wedding took place in that softened light, small enough to feel honest, large enough to feel real. Rose scattered petals with intense concentration, as though precision might protect beauty from being misunderstood. Edmund stood beside his father, attempting dignity and failing occasionally when emotion became visible in his expression. Felix insisted on holding baby Helena throughout the ceremony, treating the responsibility with solemn seriousness. When vows were spoken, they were simpler than tradition expected. Alaric did not speak of destiny or grandeur. He spoke of attention, of presence, of learning to see before deciding. Seraphina spoke of choice, of boundaries, of a life no longer dictated by fear. The moment they were declared bound was quiet. There was no applause that felt unnecessary. Only a shared breath released across those who had once been divided by misunderstanding. In the weeks that followed, life did not become perfect. It became real in a different way. There were disagreements, tired nights, uncertain mornings. But there were also meals shared without hesitation, stories told without fear of being misread, and laughter that did not feel like a visitor. Seraphina often stood at the east wing window in the evenings, holding Helena against her shoulder while snow, when it returned, fell gently over London. Alaric would sometimes join her there without speaking, his presence no longer an intrusion but a continuation. One night, Edmund asked if everything that had happened would always matter. Seraphina thought for a long time before answering. "Yes," she said, "but not in the same way." The manor behind them glowed softly, no longer a place that demanded silence, but one that had learned how to listen. As winter prepared to return once more, Seraphina stood again at the window, watching the first hints of snow gather in the distance. Alaric joined her, their shoulders almost touching but not quite leaning. "Are you afraid?" he asked quietly. She looked at him, then at the children behind them, then at the life they had rebuilt from fracture. "No," she said, "but I remember." He nodded, understanding that memory was not an enemy here but a witness. Below them, the garden lay still under approaching white. Somewhere in the quiet depth of the estate, a future continued to form without permission or warning. And as the first full snow of the season began to fall again, Seraphina realized that what the winter had left behind was not emptiness, but something far more dangerous to the past: continuation of love where it had once been denied. That night, long after the house had settled into sleep, Seraphina returned once more to the east wing window with Helena resting softly against her shoulder. The glass reflected her face beside the child's small outline, and for a moment she could see every version of herself that had existed before. Governess, exile, accused woman, and finally something still becoming. Snow drifted again, quieter than memory, and she pressed her palm lightly to the window as if acknowledging the world beyond it without fear. Alaric joined her without announcing himself, standing beside her in silence that no longer felt like distance but like shared understanding. Below them, the gardens lay untouched, waiting for morning to decide their shape again. "It still comes back," he said softly. Seraphina nodded, watching the snowfall gather on stone paths that once carried judgment and now carried only time. "Let it," she replied. Behind them, the manor lights dimmed gently as if even the house had learned to rest. Nothing in the snow demanded answers anymore, only presence, and that was enough for them both now.